This is a lecture from OpenTuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
Now we look at factors external to the company or organisation. Remember, this is still part of the rational planning model. It's still part of assessing the position of the company or organisation. And a very, very important model is the PESTEL model. This looks at the macro environment. And if you're ever asked to perform an assessment of the environment, then it's PESTEL that you reach for first. By macro environment, I mean the big things in life, national and international events, which are going to probably affect every organisation. So PESTEL stands for, first of all, political. So political events, political pressures, political changes, kind of big changes, or make big changes in what companies are faced with. For example, at the time of recording, we're in the UK partway through the Brexit process, and this brings big political changes into our environment. It will affect imports, exports, tariffs, perhaps relationships with other countries. It may affect what happens, business in the City of London and the like. And businesses must take this into account. Similarly, an election coming up. You've got one company, or one party rather, which favours high expenditure, and another one which favours low expenditure. If you are a company, say, producing roads or large contracts of that sort, large capital contracts, then if the party who favours large expenditure, high expenditure gets in, then you're probably going to do quite well. But if you're in large capital contracts, road building and so on, and the political party that wins the election is against a lot of public spending, is more of an austerity party, then presumably a lot of your market will die away. Economic. Interest rates, tax rates, whether or not the economy is going up or whether it's down, whether it's in a boom or a bust kind of situation. It's also going to affect things like exchange rates. So economic factors are immensely important. Note that it doesn't matter very much whether you regard tax as, say, political, or whether you regard tax as an economic factor. The point of PESTEL is really to act like a checklist. You're going through these 6 headings, and as long as you identify tax, it doesn't matter at all under which heading you happen to put the effect of a higher or lower tax on the companies. Next, we have social. One of the big changes in social in many countries is changes in population. Well, certainly in many Western countries, birth rates have gone down and people are living longer. So if your business is in healthcare, then you're probably going to do quite well, because the big consumers of healthcare are older people. If you're in the business of running schools and kindergartens and the birth rate is falling, then you're probably not going to do quite so well, and maybe need to think of alternative sources of revenue. Fashion comes into this, fads if you like. So we go through different fashions of, well, maybe we're in the middle of a kind of fashion of social media. People are very keen on Twitter and Facebook and so on. That might not last, or it may be supplanted by some other type of communication. We also perhaps have recently enjoyed a habit of cheap air travel. Lots and lots of cut-price air companies. And we've got into a kind of a habit or expectation, really, of kind of going on maybe a long weekend somewhere. And it could well be, even if airfares go down, we want to maintain that freedom. We like the habit. and maybe we'll try to continue that. Who knows? Next, we have the technology. Of course, the big influence there is the internet. Fantastic effect on, say, banks, on bookshops, because we've got now e-readers and so on. You can download books and so on. It is having effects on television companies who are having to compete with companies like Netflix. It's having effects on telephone companies, where it used to be you had bits of copper wire running into your apartment or house. Now, of course, most people use mobile phones. So the whole infrastructure needed is different on the technology. Big things happening in medicine. If we get changes in technology, many companies are going to be affected, whether it's a change in medicine, the internet, travel, communication, photography, television, electric cars, all sorts of stuff is radically altered. Next, sometimes it's called environmental, but I prefer to call it, instead of environmental, I prefer to call this, I call it environmental. I prefer really to call it ecological. Many companies and certainly many consumers are becoming more ecologically aware. And if people are more worried about waste being released into rivers or permanent damage being done to forests, then there will be an effect on companies who might be up to those sorts of damage-producing activities. If your customers don't want you to release polluted water into the river and they find out about it, then you're going to be in trouble. So ethically you shouldn't do it, but in a way, for your own profit and loss account, you shouldn't do it. Legal here is his last one. And of course, remember that increasing legislation is making environmental standards harder and harder to meet. There are more and more inspections, more and more rules and regulations about what has to be done. Also, people are more concerned about the recycling of waste, using sunlight or wind as renewable energy sources. And if a company doesn't respond to a movement in people's ecological awareness, it's going to be in some trouble. To my mind, I never really see very much between legal and political. It's political processes which normally change the law. But of course, for the European Union, the EU can bring in laws governing, say, minimum pay, maximum working weeks. It can bring in health and safety legislation and so on. And businesses have to live within what's allowable, what is permittable, what's legal. If they don't, they are being very unethical. And apart from that, they're going to come in for large fines, damages, and perhaps lose a right or license to trade. So whenever you see an environmental analysis, a phrase like environmental analysis, PESTEL is what you want to reach for. The information will be in the question, but if the question tells you nothing about, say, the environmental changes or the legal changes, maybe nothing about the social changes, you don't need to say anything about those. You can go down your checklist and say, well, there's something in the question about political changes. Is that kind of good or bad for the company? Maybe how should it respond? There's something in the question about economic changes that are being forecast. How should we respond to that? And maybe there's something in the question about technological changes. Just don't mention the other ones. And you don't need to bring in current events. So even on the day before the exam, if, for example, the US dollar crashed or the oil price rocketed, you're not really expected to be bringing that in. Exams are written really at least a year in advance, and they're not written with the idea of you bringing in the latest events. It may actually upset the question a little bit, if you don't respond to actually the information which is given in the question and then which fits the requirements. Porter's diamond we'll talk about here. Porter's diamond is to do with the competitiveness of nations. And we know automatically, really, if you say, for example, what is Germany good for? Nearly everyone says it's good for cars. If you say what is Japan good for, well, people will say consumer electronics, then they may say optics, cameras, and the like. If they say, ask you what is France good for, then the answer is likely to be wine and cheese. And Porter began thinking, why is it that certain countries, and it's countries, nations, it's not companies, why do certain countries get a good reputation for certain products and services? And he said, first of all, it kind of starts with your factor conditions. And you can have basic factor conditions. So basic factor conditions are things like your climate and your natural resources. So one of the reasons that France is good for wine is that grapes grow very well in that climate. It's fair to say that, unless there's awfully fast global warming, that Iceland is never going to be a big wine producer. We also have it maybe in Germany in cars. Well, Germany has iron ore. It has got coal and so on. It had everything that was required to make steel. So that gives it, if you like, a kind of head start. There's also advanced. So advanced factor conditions are things like the infrastructure that the country puts in, or maybe the educational system, or maybe the legal system which is there. For example, Ireland has done very well as the European home of the European branches of many American IT companies. Why has Ireland done so well? Well, the factor conditions are, first of all, the citizens speak English, which is useful for the American head office. Secondly, there is quite a reasonably high birth rate in Ireland, so lots of young people coming onto the job market. Third, Ireland has a pretty good educational system. So you have many good, well-educated, English-speaking young people coming onto the market, and that just fits in with what the American IT companies need as their foothold in Europe. And then Porter said, well, we start at home. Demand conditions really means home demand conditions. So parts of Scotland are very well known for making tweed, a heavy cloth. And the factor conditions are that a lot of sheep in Scotland, so wool is made there. To some extent, another factor condition is that the weather in Scotland, certainly in winter, is often dark, wet and cold. And the home demand condition was that people, when before advanced fabrics were made, needed clothing that was windproof and water resistant. And that's where the tweed, the Scottish or Hebridean tweed industry started. What he's really saying is that you have to get good at home. You have to almost practice at home. And the way you are made to practice at home is not only making goods at home, but also having rivalry at home. So it must be easy for other companies to start up and for there to be a competitive environment. If you are a monopoly supplier, you are not likely to be that good. Excellence comes with competition. So the reason that, for example, wine is very good, French wine is very good, first of all, they can grow the stuff, Secondly, they like to drink it themselves. But third, there are many different wineries which are all competing with one another. And it's easy for them to be set up. Similarly, if you think about cameras in Japan, you have Olympus, you have Nikon, you have Pentax, you have Canon, you have Fujichrome. All of these are world-class organizations, and they become world-class really by starting at home and getting really good at home. And when you're really good at home, you're world-class, you can go out and you can kind of beat the world. The fourth reason we have is related and supporting industries. So what you get is almost a cluster of industries which all support each other. So if you went to the west coast of America, went to California, which is a part of America which is particularly renowned for IT, well, you have companies there which make the chips. You've got Intel. A couple of companies that make computers. You have, say, got Apple for one. There used to be companies like Dell, there's Hewlett-Packard, and so on. You've got companies there which write software. So you have Microsoft, you have Oracle, and so on. And basically they can all kind of almost feed off each other, and they help one another. And sometimes staff will move around, and you get this really solid expertise in the country to support the industry. Three really slides now dealing with maybe what drives environmental changes. Just kind of mentioned in passing. And the first one we'll mention is industry convergence. Big kind of environmental change. In a way, you're getting fewer but bigger companies. So airlines now, if you book a flight, they will probably offer you accommodation, insurance, and car hire, and maybe even a hotel room for the night before your flight. So instead of having all of these being offered separately, it's all offered by one. If you think of the telecommunications companies, which just used to provide you with telephone, now they provide you with telephone, they provide you with your broadband or ADSL, they will provide you with television programs, films, and so on. So again, the one supplier really is supplying 3, 4, 5 maybe different elements of the whole communication package. And if you think of mobile phones, well, nowadays it is a phone. You get very good cameras with them. It acts as your GPS to help you find your way around the place, produces a map, shows you where you are on the map, and so on. You can browse the internet, you can listen to the radio. And for example, this convergence which we're getting of a small number of bigger firms can make it very, very difficult indeed for small niche players to find a home or to survive. For example, why would you carry around what you might call a mid-range camera when your mobile phone takes very good photographs indeed nowadays? There's still a place for very good cameras with very high specs, but mid-range cameras, the kind of thing you used to, quite portable and so on, there's almost no need for them. Similarly, we have, or used to have, not browsers for the GPS. There used to be a piece of hardware called a TomTom. Here's a little device you could put on your windscreen, and it picked up the GPS satellites, and it would produce a map and show you where you were, and would give you directions. You can still get TomToms, but by and large they're getting harder almost to source, because mobile phones do very, very good mapping indeed, and very, very good at giving you directions. So again, why do you need a separate device? And again, it's getting harder and harder for maybe some of these specialist firms to keep earning a living. The international dimension also has to be mentioned. Now, if you look at the car firms, there aren't that many. You've got the Volkswagen, you've got the Nissans, you've got the Toyotas, and so on. There's maybe Fords, General Motors. There's maybe about half a dozen really big ones. Why is that? Well, it's mainly been driven by cost. If you can make or design essentially one car in terms of its engine and so on, and you can sell millions of units of those throughout the world, you're going to bring down the cost. You might make little cosmetic differences, little branding differences, but 80% of the parts in the car are going to be the same. So we have global market convergence. The more, when you go to countries and look at the cars they have there, you can see, well, it's just a variant of a model I know by another name available in another country. There's global competition as well. We have to be aware of that. If we can export to the world, by and large the world can export to us. And this tends to drive the game upwards. Your products have to be better specifications, better quality. You probably have to launch them quite several times during the year, new models and so on. Otherwise, this kind of global competition coming in from all over the place is going to pound you to bits. And then we have government influences. Governments want to create employment for their citizens, and of course they will offer money to attract manufacturing plants in and so on. And that could be valuable to some countries, to some companies, when they're thinking, where do I set up my factory? Well, what country is going to offer me the best deal, the best subsidy? Strategic drift. Strategic drift is a name given to the situation where an organization fails to keep in tune or fails to keep up with the changing environment. So what we have at the start here, we have the environment kind of going up like this, maybe a change in pace or a change in taste, or maybe it's a change in technology, but the company is kind of keeping fairly close to that, bringing out new models and adopting new technology and so on. So they're doing pretty well. But then, for some reason, either because the company takes its eye off the ball or the environment accelerates away, we get a kind of divergent, we get a drift. This here is the kind of measure of the drift. They begin to separate. And when you're talking about drift, it's slow. It's almost imperceptible until it's too late. And suddenly you find yourself here where what you're doing is really quite different to what the customers want within that. And when you find that there is this gap opened up, panic is likely to ensue. So this state of flux here is the company trying this, trying that, trying to catch up, if you like, trying to maybe predict what the market wants in the future. And this can go two ways. First of all, it could be transformational. The company does get rescued or rescues itself and suddenly catches up with the environment and what the consumers want, and kind of all is well again. Or it keeps trying these experiments, and each failed experiment costs money, and it will die. It will, if it can't do the transformational change, it will perish, because the company will not be able to keep selling its old goods or providing its old services to customers who want something entirely different. But it does, the strategic drift is where this departure or divergence happens slowly. It's not because of a sudden change. That's another cause for difficulties. But drift is this unperceived slow change, and you find yourself in trouble. Finally, in this chapter, we look at scenario planning. Think of the PESTEL idea. We had 6 variants there. And let's say, politics could go good, go bad for us. Economics could go good, go bad for us. Socially, people could like our product or not like it. Technologically, maybe we back the right product, don't back the right product, and so on. So we could go, right, wrong, right, wrong, right, wrong on all 6 of those variables. Now that will give you, if it's 6 of them, that is going to give you 64 permutations of pattern of where you get it right, where you get it wrong. And you cannot possibly evaluate that number of options to see what's best. What scenario planning does is to take all of the permutations of things that could happen and tries to distill them down to a set of things which are internally consistent and which might happen as a set. So if we look at the politics in economics, if one particular party gets in, then they have a particular view on economics. If socially people want to move in a certain way, then that might actually be enabled by a change in technology. So here, for example, we've got 2 political events that could happen. Party A or Party B could become the governing party. And we know in the future 2 economic events could occur. Interest rates could go to 3% or 7%. Now already we've got 4 permutations in there. But if we knew that Party A was a party which liked spending money, was in favour of government spending, then interest rates will probably go up. Because that government will have to raise money. The way it raises money by borrowing, for example, is it has to issue government bonds, and to issue enough, it'll have to raise interest rates. If Party B is the party which is against an increase in public spending, it's more the austerity party, then it will be able to keep interest rates down, probably. First of all, if there's austerity, there's probably not as much inflationary pressure, and if there's not as much inflationary pressure, then you can keep interest rates down. With lots of spending, another reason for putting expenditure up is that there's inflationary pressure. So what we could do is we could map out 2 scenarios here, one with Party A and 7% interest, another one thinking, well, what are we going to do if it's Party B and 3% interest? But we simply don't need to try those. So we end up with a limited number of kind of viable scenarios, and that's what we plan on. We can't plan on every possible permutation.